I never thought I'd say these words, but I finally forgave my father. My name is Harold. I'm 73 years old, and for most of my life, I carried a weight I didn't even understand. A weight made of silence, resentment, and years of missed moments. He was never the father I hoped for, distant, harsh, unyielding. And for decades, I let that define me. Let it shape my relationships, my confidence, my heart. But a few years ago, something shifted. I began to see him not as the man who hurt me, but as a human being trapped by his own fears and pain. And through that understanding, I discovered something life-changing about forgiveness, about freedom, and about love. By the end of this story, I want you to understand how forgiving someone who seemed unforgivable can unlock a kind of peace you might never have imagined. And if you've ever struggled with someone in your past, whether it's a parent, a friend, or even yourself, this story is for you. I remember the first time I realized how much anger I carried. It was subtle, at first a sharp tone in my voice when someone disagreed with me, a sudden tension when my son asked a simple question. I didn't recognize it as the same anger I had toward my father until my wife, Anne, looked at me one evening and said softly, "You're still holding on to him, Harold." Her words were like a mirror I didn't want to look into. I had spent my entire adult life telling myself I was over it, that I had moved past the bruises, the coldness, the emotional absences. But in truth, I had buried it, packed it neatly in the corners of my mind, convincing myself it was gone. And yet, there it was, creeping into my every interaction, shaping my life in ways I never admitted. I grew up in a small town in Ohio. My father, Richard, was a man of few words, and most of them carried weight, judgment, or disappointment. My earliest memories of him are of a stern face looming over the dinner table, a voice that could freeze the air, and a presence that demanded attention, but gave very little warmth. I loved him, in my own childlike way, but I also feared him. And that fear, combined with confusion, grew into resentment. By the time I was in my 20s, I had learned to speak only when necessary, to shield myself emotionally, and to build walls around my heart that would last for decades. I thought I understood love because I could feel it toward my mother, toward friends, toward my wife. But the love I carried was always cautious, always measured. I didn't realize it until my own son, Michael, was born. When I held him in my arms, I felt a love so raw, so consuming, it scared me. And I recognized the patterns I had inherited. From my father, the distance, the restraint, the unspoken rules about emotion. It was a Tuesday morning when the memory hit me. I was sitting in my study, sorting through old photographs, trying to decide what to donate to the local historical society. I came across a picture of my father when he was younger, laughing at some joke I couldn't remember, his eyes almost twinkling. For a moment, the man I remembered and the man in the photo didn't match. I felt a strange pang in my chest, a mix of grief, nostalgia, and confusion. Why had I held onto the anger for so long? Why had I let it define me, rather than seeing him as a flawed human being who did the best he could with what he had? I began to revisit old letters he had written, cards he had sent for birthdays or Christmases. They weren't much simple, often clumsy, but they carried an intention, a desire to connect that I had refused to see. I realized, slowly, painfully, that he had been trying in the only way he knew how. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself driving to the old house where he had lived. The neighborhood had changed, the trees had grown taller, and the paint on the house was peeling. But inside, I imagined the same kitchen, the same living room, the same echoes of my childhood. I wanted answers. I wanted closure. And more than anything, I wanted to understand why love had felt so conditional in our home. I knocked on the door. No one answered. I walked around the house, tracing the windows and walls with my memory. I could almost hear him there, moving, from room to room, grumbling, living in his own rigid world. I realized then that the man who had hurt me had also suffered in silence. He had been shaped by his own upbringing, by his fears, by the pressures of providing and being the unyielding patriarch. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Holding on to anger was not protecting me. It was chaining me to him. And the more I clung to resentment, the more I allowed his failures to echo in my own life, in my own family. The next morning, I called Michael. I told him about the night I spent at my father's house. He listened quietly. I could feel his empathy, his curiosity, and in that moment, I realized that forgiveness wasn't just about freeing my father. It was about freeing myself, my children, and the generations that would follow. But forgiveness was not easy. It was messy. It was uncomfortable. It required me to look at painful memories, to question long-held beliefs, and to feel emotions I had spent decades suppressing. I started with small steps. I acknowledged the hurt. I wrote letters I never sent. I spoke to Anne about my fears and my regrets. Each conversation peeled away a layer of resentment, revealing the person underneath, the person who simply wanted connection, love, and acceptance. Then came the day I finally made the decision. I would visit him not to argue, not to blame, not to ask for an apology I might never receive, but simply to offer understanding, to say the words I had withheld for decades, to say, "I forgive you." I packed a small bag, drove to the nursing facility where he now lived, and felt my stomach churn with a mix of dread and anticipation. When I saw him, older and frailer than I remembered, something inside me shifted. The man who had seemed so untouchable, so formidable, was now vulnerable, human, waiting for connection, just like I was. I sat beside him, took his hand, and felt the years of anger and fear slowly dissolve. The words came naturally, almost hesitantly at first. "Dad, I forgive you. I forgive you for everything I thought I couldn't. I forgive you, and I hope you can forgive me too." He looked at me, tears in his eyes, and whispered something I would never forget. "I was scared too, son. I didn't know how to be different. I'm sorry." At that moment, something profound happened. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a sudden flood of love or relief. It was quiet, subtle, like the dawn creeping over the horizon. A weight I had carried for decades was lifted, not just from him, but from me. And yet, even with this moment of reconciliation, I knew my journey was far from over. Forgiveness was not a single event. It was a process, a lifetime of understanding, patience, and compassion. And as I left the nursing facility that day, I knew the next steps would be even harder, but even more rewarding. I didn't know it at the time, but that visit marked the beginning of a deeper exploration into my own life, my own mistakes, and my own capacity for love. I began to see patterns I hadn't noticed before, the times I had been too harsh with Michael, the moments I had shut down emotionally with Anne, the habits I had carried that mirrored my father's shortcomings. Recognizing these patterns wasn't easy. It was humbling, and at times painful, but it was necessary. I realized that forgiving my father was only the first step. The real work was applying that forgiveness to myself, to my relationships, and to the life I still had ahead of me. And then, one evening, as I sat alone in my study, a thought hit me with startling clarity. What if I had wasted all these years carrying anger that wasn't serving anyone? What if the resentment had cost me moments I could have shared with my children, my grandchildren, my friends? I felt a rush of regret, but also determination. I would not let the past dictate the rest of my life. I would actively choose forgiveness, compassion, and understanding, not because it was easy, but because it was the only path to freedom. And yet, I also knew the hardest part was yet to come. I had confronted my father, yes, I had said the words. But could I truly let go of the fear and bitterness that had taken root over decades? Could I reshape my identity from someone defined by hurt into someone defined by love and acceptance? I didn't have the answers yet. I only knew that I had to try. Tomorrow, I would sit with him again. I would ask questions, listen to stories I had never heard, and try to understand the man behind the stern face. And maybe, just maybe, in doing so, I would finally understand myself. But tonight, I drove home, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart heavy yet light, and whispered to the empty car, "This is just the beginning." And as the streetlights flickered past, I realized that forgiveness is not an event, it is a journey. And every journey begins with a single, courageous step. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. There was a quiet in the house that felt almost sacred, as if the world itself had paused to give me space to reflect. I made coffee, sat by the window, and thought about the day ahead. I wasn't nervous anymore, not in the way I used to be. Instead, I felt a strange combination of anticipation and calm, a readiness to face a part of my life I had avoided for decades. I drove slowly to the nursing facility, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. Each turn of the tires against the pavement felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. This wasn't just a visit. This was a pilgrimage of sorts, a chance to witness change, to embrace understanding, to feel something I had long denied myself. When I entered the common area, my father was sitting in the same chair as yesterday, looking out the window at the frost-covered trees. He looked smaller somehow, more fragile than I remembered, yet there was a quiet dignity in his posture. He turned when he heard my footsteps, and our eyes met. I saw recognition there, yes, but also something I hadn't expected, relief. We sat in silence for a moment, just the two of us. I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock, the soft hum of the heater, and the distant shuffle of nurses in the hallway. In that quiet, I realized something profound. Silence could be comforting. It didn't have to be filled with tension or unspoken grievances. Sometimes it could simply be a shared space between two people learning to see each other again. "Good morning, Dad," I said softly, almost hesitantly. "Morning, Harold," he replied, his voice raspier than I remembered, but warm in its own way. I thought about all the mornings I had wished for this moment, all the times I had hoped for a conversation that could bridge the gap between us. And now it was here. I began by asking questions, simple, open-ended questions, about his childhood, his memories of his parents, the moments that shaped him. I listened more than I spoke. For so long, I had assumed I knew him, had constructed a version of my father that fit my own story of hurt. But sitting there, I realized I didn't know him at all. I only knew my perception, my interpretation, my resentment. He told me stories I had never heard. About growing up in a small Ohio town, about the fear he felt when his father was strict and unyielding, about mistakes he had made in his youth that still haunted him. I could see the tension leave his shoulders as he spoke, as if the act of sharing his own vulnerability was a kind of liberation. And I realized something I hadn't before. My father was human. Flawed, yes. Hardened, yes. But human. And in recognizing that, I began to see my own flaws with a different lens. I saw the times I had mirrored his patterns, the ways I had unconsciously repeated cycles of anger, the ways I had held back love. Because I was afraid of being hurt, we talked for hours. The conversation wasn't perfect. There were pauses, moments of awkward silence, and tears on both sides. But each pause, each tear, felt like a thread being rewoven into a tapestry that had been frayed for decades. I began to understand that forgiveness isn't a single act. It's a series of choices, moments, and realizations that accumulate over time until they transform your entire perspective. At one point, he reached for my hand. It was unsteady, his fingers trembling slightly, but the gesture carried more weight than words could. "I wish I had known how to be better," he said, his voice breaking. I squeezed his hand gently. "You did the best you could with what you knew, Dad. That's all anyone can do." And in that moment, I felt a shift within myself. The anger, the resentment, the fear, they didn't vanish entirely, but they began to dissolve. I could breathe more freely. I could see more clearly. I could finally separate the man I loved from the man I resented. After our talk, we took a walk around the facility's small garden. The frost still clung to the grass, sparkling in the weak morning light. He moved slowly, leaning on his cane, and I matched my pace to his. We didn't speak much. Sometimes words aren't necessary. Sometimes presence is enough. As we walked, I reflected on the years we had lost. The arguments, the silences, the missed birthdays and holidays. And I allowed myself to grieve, not in anger, but in recognition. It was okay to feel sorrow for what hadn't been, as long as I didn't let it define what could still be. That afternoon, I returned home with a sense of clarity I hadn't known in decades. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't about excusing bad behavior. It's not about pretending pain didn't exist. It's about acknowledging the hurt, facing it honestly, and choosing to release it. Not for the other person, but for yourself. Over the following weeks, I made regular visits. Each encounter revealed new layer stories, regrets, insights, and moments of laughter I had never imagined sharing. I began to see my father not only as my parent, but as a man shaped by circumstance. Striving, sometimes failing, but always human. At home, I noticed changes too. I became more patient with Michael, more present with Anne. I noticed how the lessons from my reconciliation were rippling outward, touching relationships that had once been strained or distant. By forgiving my father, I had opened a door within myself, a door to empathy, understanding, and connection that extended beyond a single relationship. One evening, I found myself alone, reflecting on the journey. I realized that forgiveness had another layer I hadn't anticipated. It required self-forgiveness. I had spent years blaming myself for carrying anger, for not confronting the past sooner, for perpetuating cycles I had inherited. But as I acknowledged my own humanity, I felt a weight lift, a recognition that growth is always possible, no matter how late in life it comes. I began to journal, writing letters to my father that I didn't always send, and letters to myself, acknowledging fears, regrets, and hopes. Writing became a form of therapy, a way to solidify the lessons I was learning. And in those pages, I discovered a truth I wish I had known decades earlier. Every moment is an opportunity for change, for healing, for love. It wasn't all smooth. Some days, old resentment would creep back, triggered by memories or imagined slights. But instead of allowing it to control me, I observed it, acknowledged it, and let it pass. I realized that forgiveness isn't a destination. It's a practice. It's a series of small, conscious choices to see beyond hurt, to recognize humanity, and to embrace compassion. Months later, I received a phone call from my father. He had been thinking about a story from his youth, something he hadn't shared with anyone. As he spoke, I listened intently, marveling at the depth of his experiences, the complexity of his emotions, and the vulnerability he allowed himself to express. I felt gratitude not just for the moments we shared, but for the journey itself. I also began to notice a shift in myself. I laughed more freely. I expressed love more openly. I reached out to friends I had lost touch with. Forgiveness, I realized, was contagious. It spread outward, touching lives in ways I hadn't imagined. And perhaps most importantly, it allowed me to confront my own mortality with a sense of peace. There was a quiet evening, sitting on my porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, when I truly understood the depth of what had happened. Forgiving my father didn't erase the past. It didn't change the fact that pain had been inflicted or that mistakes had been made. But it changed me. It freed me. It allowed me to live fully in the present, to embrace love without fear, and to approach the future with hope rather than regret. I think about the younger Harold, often the one burdened by anger, by fear, by the unspoken rules of a strict household. I would tell him, it's never too late to let go. It's never too late to see the person behind the pain, to recognize their humanity, and to choose love. And I believe that, truly, forgiveness is a gift you give to yourself, even when it feels impossible. It's messy, it's emotional, and it requires courage, but the rewards are profound. The relief, the peace, the ability to connect deeply with others is worth every tear shed along the way. As I reflect now, I see how this journey has shaped every part of my life. It has influenced how I parent, how I love, how I engage with the world. It has taught me that resentment is heavy, but compassion is light. That anger can chain you, but understanding can set you free. I often think about my father in his final years. We never became perfect companions, nor did we erase decades of silence entirely. But we found a way to coexist, to understand, to forgive. And in doing so, I discovered a lesson I want to leave with anyone listening. It is never too late to reconcile, to heal, to forgive. Life is short, and the moments we lose to anger or pride are gone forever. But the moments we invest in understanding, compassion, and love can echo across generations. They shape not just us, but everyone we touch. Hope my story encourage you to take the first step, however small, toward forgiveness. Reach out. Speak the words. Listen. Be brave enough to see the human behind the hurt. Because when you do, you might just find that the freedom you are seeking was waiting for you all along. And in that freedom, you will discover hope, peace, and a profound sense of connection that makes the struggles, the pain, and the years of silence all worth it. If this helped you, subscribe and join us in exploring the wisdom of life, one story at a time.